If you speak French today and a situation has completely fallen apart, if your plan has catastrophically failed, control is slipping away, and there is absolutely no route out, you use this phrase. The expression comes from a freezing river in what is now modern Belarus, and more specifically, it comes from 4 desperate days in November 1812, when the shattered, freezing remnants of Napoleon's retreating army reached its icy banks. But there is a deeply awkward historical fact hiding behind this famous expression. Napoleon Bonaparte was not destroyed at the Berezina River. He got away. The Russian armies had a genuine, golden opportunity to completely trap him there, block the only road west, and finish what months of brutal winter campaigning had already begun. Instead, Napoleon found a hidden crossing point. He deliberately misled part of the Russian high command, had 2 improvised wooden bridges built by men standing in freezing water, and miraculously managed to move the core of his organized army across the river. That is exactly why the Bérézina is incredibly difficult to describe simply as a defeat. What happened on those banks looked like the end of the world to the people living through it, and it was remembered as an apocalyptic catastrophe. Yet, the central military fact remains. The trap did not close. By late November, the once invincible Grande Armée bore absolutely no resemblance to the massive, glittering force that had confidently entered Russia months earlier. The tragic condition of its cavalry makes the point perfectly. Napoleon still had highly decorated cavalry generals, but the army increasingly did not have any cavalry left for them to command. The vast majority of the horses were dead. They'd been eaten, abandoned, or were simply too weak from starvation to carry a rider. Because of this, Napoleon gathered the mounted officers who still survived into a temporary, desperate formation called the Sacred Squadron. Roughly 500 officers were grouped together. Division generals, men accustomed to commanding thousands, were now filling the lowly ranks, normally occupied by common troopers. The prestigious titles and experienced commanders were all still there, but the raw material that made an army function was rapidly disappearing. Horses, food, basic equipment, and healthy soldiers were gone. The Sacred Squadron proved that no usable horse could be wasted on pride or rank. Those still physically fit enough to hold a weapon moved in the exact same miserable column as desperately wounded men. Soldiers permanently separated from their broken units, terrified civilians, and overloaded baggage wagons. Napoleon had to somehow force this entire chaotic moving mass through a rapidly narrowing opening before 3 separate Russian armies converged and crushed them. Geography was turning fatally against the French. The road toward relative safety lay to the west, with the freezing Berezina River standing directly in between. A Russian army under Admiral Chichagov had marched up from the south and seized Borisov, the only obvious, paved crossing point. Another Russian army under Wittgenstein was rapidly approaching from the north. Meanwhile, Kutuzov's massive main army remained directly behind the French, pressing them relentlessly westward. If the Russians could just hold the principal river crossings long enough for these massive forces to link up, the river itself would act as the anvil, and the Russian armies would be the hammer. The long, sturdy bridge at Borisov had already been heavily damaged and burned in the fighting. Rebuilding it under the direct, heavy fire of Russian cannons was not a practical option. Every single hour spent trying to force a passage gave another Russian force more time to arrive on the French flanks. Before Napoleon could even think about winning a battle, he desperately needed somewhere to cross. The first useful clue to salvation came from an almost accidental observation. General Jean-Baptiste Courbinot had been trying to make his way back toward the main French army. After finding the main crossing at Borisov heavily blocked, he moved upstream along the banks of the Bérézina in search of another passage. Near a small village called Studianka, his men encountered a local Lithuanian peasant. What instantly caught the French general's attention was the physical condition of the peasant's horse. The horse was entirely wet, as if it had just waded through deep water. Courbinot immediately took the peasant as a guide. The general personally followed him across a hidden ford in the river, confirmed that a shallow passage actually existed near Studianka, and then carried the life-saving information back to the French command. A route that might save Napoleon's entire empire was revealed not by a brilliant map or a complex reconnaissance report, but by a single, dripping wet horse. But simply finding the ford only solved half of the nightmare. The freezing water had already risen. Tens of thousands of infantrymen, heavy brass cannons, overloaded wagons, and wounded stragglers could not simply be pushed through freezing, chest-deep water on foot. Bridges were still absolutely required. Furthermore, the fort at Studianka would only remain useful as long as the Russian commander Chichagov firmly believed the main French breakout was taking place somewhere else. The French, therefore, had to magically create both a real crossing and a highly convincing fake one. 300 French soldiers and several hundred loud, chaotic stragglers were deliberately sent downstream. Their strict orders were to violently collect bridge-building materials. cut timber, and make as much noise as humanly possible to attract Russian scouts. Meanwhile, a division of heavy cavalry moved out into the open where the Russians could clearly see their armor shining in the snow. The deception also included planting fake intelligence. French officers brought in several local Jewish residents and deliberately questioned them loudly about the lower river ford and the roads heading south. The officers made a great theatrical show of being satisfied with what they heard, and then intentionally allowed some of the locals to pass beyond the French outposts, where the fake story could quickly spread to the Russians. The ruse worked perfectly. Before the real crossing began, the Russians were given a fake crossing to watch. Chichagov shifted his massive army's attention south. The deception did not need to hold for weeks. It only needed to buy a handful of hours. That was the narrow, closing window General Jean-Baptiste Eblé had to use. General Eblé arrived at the frozen river without a proper bridging train. Much of the French army's heavy pontoon equipment had already been dragged into the snow and abandoned because there were simply no horses left to haul it. Eblé reached the village of Studianka with only 2 portable field forges, 2 wagons of raw coal, 6 wagons carrying basic tools, and a few dedicated companies of engineering. Weeks earlier in the retreat, knowing a river crossing was inevitable, Eblé had strictly ordered his men to keep their essential tools. They had even stripped heavy iron from abandoned wagon wheels along the road, carrying the dead weight on their backs so it could later be forged into clamps and fittings for bridge frames. The road out of Russia would have to be built entirely from scrap. 2 blacksmith forges, a limited set of hand tools, timber forcefully ripped from nearby wooden houses, and iron salvaged from broken wheels. Even then, the construction was a nightmare. The first wooden bridge supports proved too weak against the current and had to be dragged out and rebuilt. At the exact same time, the shallow ford Corbino had found was rapidly disappearing under rising, freezing water. The French engineers had to work directly in the vicious current while massive, jagged pieces of ice floated past them, striking their chests. Men stood in the freezing water so deep that the river rose almost to their mouths. They repeatedly entered the icy water to place, secure, and hammer the heavy wooden supports by hand. Many of these engineers never recovered from the exposure. They simply froze to death in the current, washing away beneath the very bridge they were building. By the afternoon of November 26th, the first fragile bridge could be used. A second, stronger bridge was built alongside it, intended specifically for the heavy brass artillery and the baggage wagons. But this heavy bridge repeatedly failed under the immense weight and splintered, needing constant, frantic repairs. Each structural failure sent Eblé's freezing men straight back into the ice water, leaving massive columns of desperate traffic building up on the eastern bank. There was now a road across the river, but it was never stable. It remained a terrifying, working construction site while an entire shattered army moved over it. While the engineers froze, the rest of the army starved. Sergeant Burgonia, an infantryman waiting to cross, remembered this exact period not for the grand strategy, but for the paralyzing hunger. Near Studianka, someone told Burgonia that a wooden house once used by Napoleon had previously served as a flour store. The Russians had long since swept the building and removed absolutely everything. But Burgonia was starving, so he went inside anyway. Seeing tiny gaps between the wooden floorboards, he pulled out his sword and began violently scraping the cracks. He spent more than an hour on his hands and knees, desperately working at the wood. He eventually collected roughly 2 pounds of dirty material. Some of it was actually flour. The rest was pure dirt, crushed straw, and small splinters of wood. Burgonia considered this a miraculous find. He carefully mixed the dirty flour with freezing water into a thick paste, cooked for small, hard cakes over a fire, and shared them with his freezing comrades. In his pockets, he was carrying hundreds of francs in hard gold and silver. But money had completely lost its value. He would have gladly traded every piece of gold he owned for a single piece of bread. Flour scraped from filthy floorboards mattered more than a fortune. While the organized army slowly pushed across the bridge's infantry first, then the surviving guard with Napoleon, followed by the heavy wagons, the clock ran out on the deception. The Russian commander Chichagov finally realized he had been tricked. He immediately turned his army around. At the same time, Wittgenstein's army was closing in fast from the north and east. The trap was snapping shut. Brutal, desperate fighting immediately erupted on both sides of the river at once. On the western bank, the French marshals Oudinot and later Michel Ney had to aggressively push Chichagov back just to keep the exit open. If they failed, the army would cross the bridges only to march directly into a Russian firing line. On the eastern bank, Marshal Victor had to hold Wittgenstein's massive army far enough away from the bridges so the stragglers could continue crossing. For Marshal Ney, it was just another desperate rearguard emergency in a retreat entirely defined by them. Days earlier, Ney had been completely cut off and demanded to surrender. He refused, marched his men across the frozen Dnieper River, and miraculously rejoined Napoleon, who had thought him dead. Now, at the Berezina, Ney threw his remaining exhausted cavalry into a desperate charge. They smashed into the advancing Russian lines, stabilizing the perimeter. Ney didn't need a glorious textbook victory. He just needed enough space to keep the muddy road open a little longer. By this point, the wooden bridges had been opened for roughly 2 days. Yet, one of the most tragic and difficult aspects of the entire Berezina story is that thousands of people still had not crossed. The familiar historical painting is one of desperate, screaming fugitives fighting for access to bridges that cannot carry them fast enough. And that absolute chaos did happen. But for long stretches of time before the panic, many stragglers simply stayed near their campfires on the eastern bank instead of crossing while the route was completely open. Some were completely paralyzed by exhaustion, pushed beyond what a rested human mind can even imagine. Others stubbornly remained with overloaded wagons holding food, heavy winter clothing, or the last physical possessions they had looted in Moscow. Some simply looked at the dark water and believed there was still plenty of time. During the freezing night of November 27th, the bridges were deeply underused. People settled into the snow around Studenka and actively resisted leaving the warmth of their fires. Desperate French officers walked through the camps, violently kicking men, trying to push them into moving. They even set fire to baggage wagons, trying to force people to abandon their useless property and walk across the river. Still, thousands refused to move. After weeks of unrelenting starvation, sub-zero cold, and broken sleep, the human brain simply stops responding to logic. Crossing meant leaving the immediate, life-saving warmth of a fire. It meant abandoning property carried for hundreds of painful miles. It meant standing on frostbitten feet and entering a terrifying, moving crowd in the pitch black. During the night, the booming Russian guns seemed distant. The fire was right here. At dawn, that psychological illusion shattered. As Russian artillery fire suddenly became audible and cannonballs began smashing into the trees on the eastern bank, the thousands of stragglers who had spent the night sleeping near Studianka stood up and rushed the bridges all at once. A passage that had been nearly empty hours before instantly became a terrifying crush of human panic. Screaming people, terrified horses, heavy wagons, and wounded men violently converged on narrow wooden entrances built for single-file traffic. When the heavier artillery bridge failed again and snapped under the weight, the pressure grew apocalyptic. Russian artillery zeroed in on the massive, packed crowds. Carts overturned, entirely blocking the wooden planks, while the freezing river below quickly filled with shattered ice and human bodies. Inside this total chaos, a single small boat attempting to cross, carrying a mother and 2 young children, overturned in the current. An exhausted artilleryman, who had been violently fighting his way through the massive crowd just to save himself, saw them fall. He threw himself out of the crush, dove directly into the freezing river, and managed to drag the younger child onto the ice. The shivering child cried out for his drowning mother. The artilleryman looked at the boy and told him he had not pulled him from the ice only to leave him to die on the bank. The chaotic crossing continued late into the evening. Marshal Victor's men were still fiercely holding off the Russians on the eastern bank, forming a final wall of flesh and gunpowder between the enemy and the burning bridges. Victor did not begin withdrawing his own bleeding troops until after dark. Once the organized rear guard was finally across, the strategic problem changed entirely. The bridges had successfully served their military purpose. The core of the army was saved. Leaving them standing for even 1 more hour could potentially save more stragglers, but it heavily risked handing the pursuing Russian armies a perfect, ready-made route across the river to hunt Napoleon down. General Eblé, the man whose freezing engineers had built the crossing with their lives, now had to prepare to destroy it. Warnings were shouted into the dark. People were still massed on the eastern bank, but incredibly, some of those gathered around the fires still did not move until the danger was right on top of them. On the freezing morning of November 29th, with Russian infantry rapidly approaching the riverbank, the terrible decision could no longer be postponed. General Eblé gave the order. The wooden bridges at Studianka were set on fire. Massive plumes of thick black smoke rose over the ice. Thousands of screaming men, women, and children were completely trapped on the eastern bank with their wagons and guns. Some threw themselves into the freezing water in a desperate, suicidal attempt to swim. The rest were quickly surrounded and captured by the advancing Russians. The very wooden structures that had just saved the French Empire now had to be turned to ash so the Russians could not use them. Napoleon had escaped the trap. The Berezina is remembered as a total disaster, a synonym for absolute failure. The human cost was staggering, and the suffering was unimaginable. But the deep irony of history is that the Rio Berezina may have actually been Napoleon's last successful military operation of the entire campaign. He avoided complete annihilation, but he only escaped because thousands of others froze in the water, fought in the snow, and kept the bridges open behind him just long enough to walk away.